So welcome to the OTS Connect session, Math and ELL, Where Do I Begin? With Kathy Griffin and Avis Delgarno. It's great to have so many people represented from all over Ontario, and I know that you're going to really enjoy this session. Avis and Kathy have done a previous series with OTS for ELL, and it was very well received and excellent content. So I know that you're really going to enjoy the evening. So thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Kathy and Avis.
Thank you, Melly. So I'm going to just introduce myself first. I'm Kathy Griffin, and I've been teaching for 18 years in New Zealand, BC, Alberta, and now back in Ontario. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I got started again really looking at my math practice, and so I've been sort of continually taking a look at open-ended problems, parallel questions, rich problems. But last year, our board got our very first ELL lead teacher in Avis, and we started looking as a staff at our practice in math and ELL. And so Avis and I have been collaborating a lot on inquiries and trying to move our practice in that area. Avis, do you want to go ahead with your introduction?
I'd like to welcome everybody, and my name's Avis Delgarno, and I'm sitting in Kincardine right now just to place myself if we're spatially aware. I've been teaching since the early 70s, so that means I've got about 20 years within the Ontario elementary system, as well as teaching ESL in Ottawa, at the University of Ottawa, Algonquin College, so that was with adults, and in the northern regions of Ontario with First Nations communities. I've taught outside of Canada for, again, 20 plus years, in Nigeria, in Zambia, in the Solomon Islands, which is in the South Pacific, and most recently in the Middle East, in Kuwait, in the United Arab Emirates. So that's sort of my background, and I am the ESL ELD system lead teacher in Blue Water. We don't have any ESL teachers in the classrooms, in the schools in Blue Water as of yet. It's kind of new for us to identify our ELLs and to support them. So that's where we are at this point.
So we want to check in a little bit with who you are, and if you could just use your clip art icon at the bottom of the toolbar and just mark somewhere for yourself what grade you teach. So I'm going to start, and although I'm alert right now, learning resource teacher, my most recent experience is in teaching grade 6 and 5-6 and 6-7. So that's where I'm putting my tick box. And we want you just to be thinking as we do these introductory slides here about what you would like to get out of this session, and feel free to use the chat room to just add any questions, anything you're hoping to get out. And of course, if you're on a mobile device, then if you can't put your icon on, please, as Christy did, let us know what your response to the slide is. So we've got quite a bit of diversity in the room, which is great. We've kind of pitched this towards a junior because that's sort of where my experience is with the math, but it's definitely applicable, the math we're looking at, to intermediate classes, and the strategies are very applicable to the primary as well. Okay.
Kathy, we didn't leave a spot, I just realized, for secondary, if we have any secondary teachers, or if we have any people who are not in the classroom but are in another position in education. So I'm not sure where we want to put those people.
So I'm just putting my pointer on. If you're in secondary, perhaps you could mark at the bottom. You're in secondary, and if you're in an alternative role like I am, maybe you could mark at the top. What do I teach here with your little icon? Great. Already somebody's taking us up on that. Wonderful. Thank you. Sorry to exclude you from our graph. Excellent. So the next slide we're going to be moving to, and I'm just going to try and get rid of my pointer there, is about how long have you been teaching? And you can interpret this graph any way you like, this line, number line. But perhaps think of it as your entire career. Where are you in terms of when you might might retire, or maybe you never will stop being an educator. So you can fill it in however you like. Excellent. We're getting a lot of variety in here. It's good for us to know if people are beginner teachers, especially, so that we can explain a few more of the things that maybe are not something you've come across, but do feel free as we go along to post your questions, anything you don't understand in the chat. We'd like you to be able to participate as much as possible in this. So not everybody has ticked, and that's totally fine, but I'm just going to move along to the next slide, and Avis is going to take over, asking you about who your English language learners are. And just so you know the context in my school and where Avis is working with me, we are at about 40% ELL Canadian-born, and the majority of our ELLs are David Martin Mennonite, so they speak Pennsylvania Deutsch. And so it's maybe a little bit different than some of your contexts, and I'll leave it over to Avis to describe the different criteria or the different categories.
Okay, I'm just going to clear up just a little bit on what Kathy said. So Kathy has 40% of the school population are English language learners, and pretty much 100% of those, if I'm right, Kathy, almost 100% are Canadian-born. So let me just explain some of the terms here for you and a little bit of the background. The Ministry of Education used to use an assessment system called Stages. There are a couple of boards that are still in transition from Stages to the new Ministry of Education assessment system called STEP, which means Steps to English Proficiency. And so you will hear about STEP, and you'll see STEP, as you can see, I've put Step 1, Step 2, 3, Step 4, 5, and Step 6 on the chart as a sort of a measure of the progress of English. There are three acronyms that you'll hear throughout this presentation. You'll hear ELL, ESL, and ELD, and let me just explain those. ELL means English language learner, and that's the person. So I might say I have an ELL in my class, meaning I have an English language learner in my class. ESL and ELD refers to the program that we put in place to support the English language learner. ESL means English second language, so that would mean that they have a language other than English as their first language, and English is their second language, or indeed sometimes it's more than a second language. And ELD means English literacy development, probably a term not as familiar as ESL. English literacy development is the program that we would put in place for the ELL who comes to us with limited prior schooling in their own language or interrupted schooling in their own language, as we're seeing with a lot of the refugees people from refugee situations who have come into Ontario in the last 2-3 months, or indeed sometimes no prior schooling in their own language. So because they have gaps, they're learning English, and we're trying to fill in the literacy gaps as well that they don't, literacy skills that they may not have brought with them. So ESL, ELD programs, ELL, the learner. Now you'll see two types, Canadian-born and people born outside of Canada. So just a quick rundown on what that means. So Canadian-born ELLs are children from immigrant families who would be the first generation born in Canada children, but at home they speak another language other than English. Canadian-born also may be from communities that have maintained a distinct linguistic and cultural tradition, such as in our board, we have a large Mennonite population in our schools, in the schools where Kathy is, school where Kathy is especially. And so they have another language at home, but they are Canadian-born, their parents are Canadian-born, their grandparents are often Canadian-born, but they have a distinct cultural and linguistic tradition. The other Canadian-born students that we'll see are students who are First Nations, Métis or Inuit, FNMI students, children, who have a language other than English as their first language, and then when they come to school, English is being learned. Now the newcomers, several situations as well for newcomers. So newcomers are born outside of Canada in a country where a language other than English is their first language. They've arrived in Canada with their family or sometimes on their own as part of a regular planned immigration process. They may be newcomers who have arrived as a result of war or crisis in their home country, and they've arrived either as refugees or as newcomers from refugee situations, which is what we're seeing right now again with the recent groups of people coming from Syria, Eritrea, Iraq, Iran, and so on. And the final group of newcomers would be our international students. They're coming often as fee-paying students or in an exchange program to attend Ontario schools for a certain amount of time. So that's the rundown on that. Now, we wanted to know if you have any familiarity with STEP. So STEP is either, I have no idea what you're talking about on the left, all the way through to, yes, I use it, I understand it on the right, or you're somewhere in between. While you're figuring out where you are on that, let me talk a little bit about STEP. Molly, if you could put up the URL for the STEP user guide. I refer you here to the STEP user guide. It's a really, really good document, has a lot of things in it, and I'm not going to ask you to look at it tonight, but hopefully you can go back and have a look at it at a time that's more convenient for you. So the Ministry of Education assessment framework called STEP is a tool to measure or assess English language proficiency on a periodic basis. It monitors the progress in English proficiency. Now, what does it do? On page 9 and 10 of the STEP user guide, there's a really good explanation of how it can assist people in different roles and responsibilities, including parents and including students. And I'm just going to give you an example of a few of these. So what is STEP? How can STEP be of use? Well, it informs school boards around making decisions for the types of programs and services that they're going to need for their ELLs. It can inform a school and help them decide about resources and planning needed to support their ELLs. And certainly it's there to help ESL teachers and as well classroom teachers in their understanding of the language acquisition process, as well as it can assist with language, offering language for teachers that could be useful as they talk to, discuss, or report to parents about the progress in English of their child. And for students and parents, it's maybe not used quite as much in this situation, but it certainly can be. For students and parents, it can help them understand that language acquisition and literacy development is an ongoing process. And it can also help them to understand the level of where they're at, the level that they're at in acquiring language. And for students, certainly can help them reflect on their own learning and their own goals. So it looks like we have a few people for whom STEP is just a little bit known, and quite a few people who know it, who know of it, and it looked like they're using it, so that's wonderful.
Great. So our plan for today is, we don't have a whole lot of time, but we're hoping to give you kind of a framework to work in, some resources to go to, some strategies to use to get started with or to improve your practice. And basically we want to get across the message that there are connections between good math pedagogy and good pedagogy for English language learners. We want to take a look at the end briefly at how to use your students as co-researchers in the process of improving your practice. We're going to give an example of student voice that has been used in our school to move our practice forward together as learners. And we encourage you to make your efforts to improve your practice transparent, to reflect on your practice, and to make that transparent to your students as well. And we'll get to that closer to the end of the session. We're coming with some assumptions about your understanding of math, but I'm going to ask Molly to put the two connections links to the first two math sessions in this series. The first one goes through planning. So it covers, I've done a session on covering the curriculum, understanding the developmental continuum of math concepts, ways to develop students to come up with a variety of strategies before you teach standard algorithms, the use of manipulatives, that sort of thing. The second in the series, so the first in the series is about planning, and the second in the series is about assessments and approaches to assessing the kind of math. So we're hoping you have an understanding of rich problems, three-part lessons, using student reflection, and having students construct their own understanding of the math rather than going for a straight transmission approach to teaching where you're giving them the process and the strategies and the algorithms right away. And if you're not familiar with the term algorithm, that means sort of a standard way of solving something. So an example of an algorithm is the traditional way probably many of us were taught to do addition, where we have, say, 21 plus 30, and we stack them one on top of each other, and we start with the ones and we add those, and if we need to carry over, rename, we do that, and then we add the tens and we get our answer. Whereas if you're asking the students to construct their own understanding, you're giving them the problem, and then they're kind of coming up with some ways of doing it. And as you work through, you kind of make sure that you're keeping track of those strategies, putting them up on the wall so that kids can use a variety of strategies mentally or on paper to solve problems before you take a look at maybe some more streamlined or efficient ways of solving problems, which could be the standard algorithm that we learned in school. So that's sort of where we're coming from. The links are there in the chat if you want to go back and take a look at the other webinars. And Avis is going to take us through some of the really good resources that are out there that you might want to look at another time. And hopefully Molly will be able to put the links in the chat box as we go along to these resources.
Okay, there are a number of Ministry of Education resources which I really feel are a must for teachers who have English language learners, and often we don't get a chance to get into these resources. They're all available on EduGains. The links are going up for them as we go into the slides. And there also should be hard copies in your schools, and if there aren't, please contact your ESL system person or an ESL teacher that you are aware of, and they can get your hard copies if that's a preferred way for you to access them. The first one on this first slide is the initial assessment, and though this assessment, user guide for initial assessment is not, it's available to everybody, but it's not often used by teachers. I just want to talk a little bit about initial assessment because it's usually an ESL teacher or an ESL system person who would do the initial assessment. It just helps you understand the importance of the initial assessment for a minute here. When we first began with the initial assessment, when a student arrives in Canada. And so this is the beginning of the support that we put in place for English language learners. Now, though the user guide gives an overview of the initial assessment, really each board has developed their own tasks and certainly their own reporting system based on this guide. Newcomer students to Canada will undergo an initial assessment of their English proficiency, and that covers three strands: oral, reading, and writing. So proficiency in English and oral, in reading and in writing. If they are literate in their own language, in other words, if they've had, a few years of schooling in their own language, then they'll often be asked to write or to do a writing sample in their own language, and this gives us a pretty good idea, even if we can't understand it, the content, we get a good idea of the literacy level that the student brings with them from their first language. and therefore normal transfer of those skills will come into the second language. We also do a math assessment, not all the time, but quite often, especially certainly for secondary students, but and more I think for elementary students. This math assessment can act as an early diagnostic for classroom teachers, gives them an idea. It's only covering number sense and enumeration, but it does give the classroom teacher a good idea of the skills that the ELL brings with them as they come into the Ontario system. This initial assessment is usually done within the first couple of weeks of arrival in Canada or of arrival to the school. And in larger boards, this is done in something called a welcome center, but in the smaller boards, it's usually done in the school by the ESL teacher or ESL lead. Now, at the end of doing the initial assessment, we place the ELL on a step. So we step them. So we determine that they are step 1, step 2, step 3 in oral and in reading and in writing. And with that, we are then able to suggest ESL or ELD program support that would be needed. And that's based on the initial interview that we do and the diagnostic tasks that we ask them to do, and also very often a family interview that's done with parents. And in some boards, a school representative would be at that meeting as well. So the classroom teachers can use the initial assessment information as they determine programming and instructional supports that are needed, and then they will continue, the classroom teacher or the ESL teacher continues to assess the proficiency in a periodic ongoing assessment using a step continuum, which we will look at in a few minutes. Now, here's some of the resources. If you are teaching kindergarten, this is an excellent resource, the Kindergarten English Language Learners, Supporting English Language Learners in Kindergarten. If you have students with limited prior schooling, in other words, ELLs who need ELD, English Literacy Development Support, then the document on the left is invaluable, and I would suggest you make sure you have it. So if you have kids coming in with gaps in the schooling, especially with the groups that have come in from Syria and so on right now, we often are seeing 2 to 3 to 4 years of no schooling, and so that child would be ELD, and this is a really good book for you to have. These two books are general for ESL students, really, really good. The book on the left is for grades 1 to 8, and the book on the right, Many Roots and Many Voices, again, a really good, full of classroom strategies, instructional strategies, and just general tips for the classroom, and really, really good information in the book on the left for anybody who is just looking for information in all sorts of areas about how to go about supporting your ELL. Now, often we have ELLs with special education needs, and that's a little bit difficult to determine, but I just wanted to refer you to a document. The link has just gone up for that, and this is a document called the Instructional Principles to use with English language learners. Very, very interesting document, and I just want you to read for a minute the quote from it that's on the screen. So at this point, I'd also like to point out the universality of the strategies that you're going to see suggested in the next few minutes. Universality of the strategies as in necessary for some, good for all. And we need to keep that in mind as we decide whether we should accommodate with strategies for the ELL, but also they're often very good for other students in the classroom, if not the whole class. Now, this is in referring to the ongoing step assessment. This is what teachers would use to establish the progress of the ELL in learning English. This is a sample of the framework for reading for grades 9 to 12. So it's just a sample. So the ESL observable language behaviors continua have two main purposes. One is to inform program planning, and the other is to track the student's language proficiency. Careful consideration was given when creating the ESL OLBs to allow for students to demonstrate high-order thinking skills at all steps, including the beginning steps. Each ESL OLB consists of a strand, and if you look at the top, you'll see oral or reading or writing, and this one is reading, so that's the strand. And each strand is guided by the Ontario Language Curriculum. Each OLB has a grade cluster, and you'll see that at the top as well. So they're clustered grade 1 to 3, grade 4 to 6, grade 7 to 8, and grades 9 to 12. So you'll see that at the top. Each OLB has 6 steps, and you see across it 6 steps. It reflects progress from a beginner level, which is step 1, towards performance at grade level, which is step 6. Each OLB has elements, and those are down the left-hand side. And these name and describe the language. Oh, I think we have a question. Is that indicating a question? Is that Sabrina?
Mumtaz, do you want to go ahead with a question? Just push your talk button and go ahead.
I'll just keep talking.
I think that we're having trouble. We're having trouble hearing her microphone. If
my microphone?
Mumtaz, I think, has a question, and if you could just push your talk button and try.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, everybody. My question is, if a student is on step 3 by the end of the year on the step document, and he's moving to grade 4, so he or she will be still on step 3. Because when I check the step documents of 1 to 3 and 4 to 6, they look alike.
Yep, they're quite similar. There's a few differences, obviously, or else it wouldn't be, separated into 2 documents. But you're right. When a child it's a great question. Thank you for asking that. When a child is transitioning from grade 3 to grade 4, the step will continue, but you'll just continue highlighting on the grade 4 to 6 grade cluster continua. Does that make sense?
So if the student is on, say, step 3 in grade 3,
yep,
and he will be on step 3 again in grade 4.
Correct, and then that's right, and then you just keep looking for or observing the language behavior and adding to that. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. We had a great conversation with our ESL teacher today, so we were looking at the documents. So we were looking. They're similar except 1 or 2 phrases. Probably those are the simple expectations. They go higher as they move from grade to grade.
That's right.
Yep.
They're very similar. They are. So I'll just thank you.
They are very similar. Yeah.
Was there anything else?
Thank you. I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, keep asking. That's great. The elements along the side, I'll just continue with the elements along the side are, they describe language concepts or skills, and they're connected to the Ontario curriculum. And then the descriptors, which is what Mumtaz was talking about. The descriptors within each element and across the steps identify what a student can do. And so these descriptors capture distinct language behaviors that can be observed. And you observe across all curriculum, not just in language time, all throughout the day, through all curriculum, you're observing their language. And when you feel that a descriptor has been mastered, that an ELL has mastered that descriptor, you are seeing it constantly, continuously, consistently, then highlight it. And that's how we determine the steps. So once every descriptor in a step has been highlighted, we would say that that student has mastered step 1, for instance, and is then developing their proficiency at a step 2 level. And then you just keep highlighting, and we can have a scattered pattern with that as well. You might have some step 2 and step 1 at the same time, and you might have oral and reading and writing it all at different steps. So that's kind of how that works. And in a few minutes we'll ask you to pull up one of these continua according to the grade that you have an ELL in. Now, I just want to mention before we move from this slide that ELD students also have, there's also a continuous. So what we see in front of us is for ESL. But there's also ELD, observable language and literacy behaviors. So they are OLLBs, just not to be confusing. And there are only 4 steps for ELDs. I didn't put the links in for them, but they are available on EduGains if you have an ELD student. There's 4 steps, the idea being that once they have completed step 4, they'll then swing over to an ESL continua for the last couple of steps. So that's how that works. We just want to talk briefly about adaptations, program adaptations. And I just want to address an understanding about accommodating and modifying for English language learners. And here I'm not talking about modifying or accommodating for exceptionalities that would come under the special education umbrella. I'm talking about accommodating or modifying for language purposes. So we don't put an ELL on an IEP unless, of course, there's a special education reason to do that. We do, however, adapt programs for language reasons for the ELL. When a program is modified, the ESL or the ELD box is ticked on the Ontario report card, and it's not ticked if the student receives accommodations only to support their language learning. And this is exactly the same as for the Spec Ed box. So if we can start with accommodations, I'm just going to flip back to the accommodations slide for a minute. If we start with accommodations, accommodations are a part of every classroom. We do it for all students using a wide range of instructional strategies depending on their needs. They can take the form of instructional accommodations, and such as mind maps, extra time, wait time, repeating information, simplifying the instructional language, and so on. It might be environmental, the use of strategic seating or grouping, or it might be for assessment accommodations for oral, extended time, offering an oral response rather than a written response, those sorts of things. Now, accommodations do not change the complexity of what is to be learned, but it breaks it up into manageable parts for the English language learner. Each of the subject-specific curriculum documents outline considerations for ELLs, which include modifications and accommodations, and they align with the ELL policy documents. Accommodations simply allow students to participate fully in an instructional program. And I just want to make an analogy here. I want you to think about eyeglasses. So a student, you may have a student who needs eyeglasses in order to see well and is permitted to wear those glasses in the classroom at all times. The eyeglasses give the student access to the materials, but they do not make the materials easier for the student, not any different than for anyone else. They just allow the student to participate fully. In other words, they level the playing field. And this is the same for accommodations for our ELLs. They do not alter the expectations of the curriculum. Rather, they allow access to the curriculum and success with the curriculum. Okay. Now, with modifications, a little bit different. So, there is no doubt that all ELLs require accommodations to be put in place right the way through from step 1 pretty much through to step 6. Modifications are a little bit different, however, and a little trickier. Modifications are actually changes to the curriculum expectations. They might be reducing curriculum expectations, adapting some curriculum expectations, that sort of thing, based on the student's proficiency in English. And it's not, I just want you to remember that it's not students who need to be modified, rather it's the expectations that need to be modified for the student. A little red note there about secondary, if you're a secondary as well. Okay, so what we'd like you to do now is do a little work. And on the screen you'll see several links to the OLBs, the Observable Language Behavior Continuum. And I'd like you to identify an ELL in your class. So you're going to choose your target student. I would like you to choose the appropriate grade cluster and click onto that link. So if you teach grade 4 to 6, click on the 4 to 6 link. You'll see it at the end of the URL. And then just think about the oral language behaviors that you observe across the curricula for that student, and just highlight the descriptors that you observe for this ELL. So I know you're doing it without having all of your evidence around you, but if you could just do that. If you haven't done this before, especially try this out right now and you'll get an idea. So if
I'm just going to put hopefully the links for us in the chat room to the 4 levels. And if people could use their button with a green check to say when you've actually been able to highlight the descriptors that you observe for the ELL, you're welcome to put some in the chat as you go along just to share with us what you're seeing. But if you let us know with a green check that you're done that part of it, then we know your progress.
Do we want to set just a short timer?
Yes, please.
How many minutes?
I think, what do you think we've got, Kathy? Is 4 minutes too long?
Let's try 4.
Okay.
And the links are all there. So Jennifer, we're going to add the resource page later. Something will come, but hopefully you can see the links above where you've written. So the first link is grade 4 to 6, and then 1 to 3, 7 to 8, and 9 to 12. And just click on the one that matches the ELL that you're thinking of from your own context. If anybody's having some difficulty, you can just let us know, but otherwise we're going to turn our microphones off while the timer runs down. Taz, I know you're just finding the links now, so don't feel rushed. We're going to be going on in a couple of moments to the next activity, but you'll have time to go to the OLD and then do the next step. That's okay. Okay, so hopefully I see quite a few green checks there that people have had a chance to take a look at the descriptors and see how they fit a specific English language learner in your care. And what we're going to do next is take a look at some of the instructional strategies that you might use for the ELLs, and I'll let Avis talk about this, if she's there. Okay, I don't see her microphone on. So we're basically...
Sorry,
okay.
Started to talk without the microphone.
Oh.
All right. For this section, we'd like you also to check the STEP user guide, and also a really, really good resource for you to have. So we're going to get you into this STEP user guide, and if the URL could be put up for that. We'd like you to look in the STEP user guide at page 21 to 23, and you'll see their instructional strategies, or just quite general strategies that are available. And when you have had a chance to look at them, if you could put into the next slide that I'm going to put up, which is a blank slide, if you could just post some strategies that you think you would recommend from the list, perhaps, that you've used, or even from your own experience, some strategies that you'd like to recommend. Just while you're going into that, I'm just going to talk for a few seconds really. Using instructional strategies, just understand that using instructional strategies to support ELLs is an accommodation. And so that's what we mean by accommodation. It means you're using an instructional strategy. It's one of the two ways of adapting a program for ELLs. We also try to accommodate as much as possible before we even ever consider modification. So accommodate is very often all that's needed. However, sometimes modification of curriculum expectations is also needed. Accommodation can be added or reduced depending on the need for a step, or depending on the need and the step level, and it's recommended that we provide accommodations right the way through to step 6. Modifications, on the other hand, may be required for ELLs to be successful with the Ontario curriculum for some subjects, not necessarily for all the subjects, and that's often while the ELL is at step 1, and sometimes when they're at step 2 and 3 as well. But certainly probably not beyond that. So have a look at this, and I'm going to turn my mic off. And if we could have the, if you could put a green check up when you've had a look at the guides, and if you could add something to our blank slide, that would be lovely. And can we give this about, what do you think, 3 minutes, 4 minutes?
Yep, I think 3 minutes, and then we'll see where we are at that time.
Okay.
Just a reminder, when you're adding your text to the blank slide, you can use the pen tool, but if you use the A text box, it's easier to type an answer in rather than handwriting it. once you have had a chance to look over some of the strategies, if you don't mind putting your green tick on, that would be great.
And if you need to make your text box a little bit bigger, you can just drag it out. And so we can read. You can just drag it out a little bit to make it a little bit bigger.
So Lisa, just above your comment in the chat box, there's a link to the EduGains resource, the STEP user guide. And if you can just open that up and go to page 21 to 23, there are a list of strategies by step level. And you can see some of the things that people are pulling out that they're seeing that would be either useful in their own practice or strategies that they use in their own practice already. So that's one source of some of the strategies. It's you had it open and didn't know the pages. Okay, you're welcome. Avis is going to be going through some of her favorite strategies that she's gotten from a variety of sources, including her own expertise, her own experience over the past numerous years teaching ELLs. And I'm just going to ask Avis to take a look at the time, and if you can get through those by 8:30, then we'll move on to some of the math. So I'll challenge you with that. I'm sorry about the time.
We can do it, Kathy. I will be finished before 8:30 because we really need to get on to the math, and I know that's what everyone's waiting for. Great strategies. Thank you for putting those up. I'm looking at dual language text. There are a number of books available, and there are a number of sites. Waterloo, Toronto District School Board, Peel, they all have some wonderful dual language projects going on. And if you Google them, you'll get some great ideas for doing that with your own classes. So I think if we could move to the next slide. So what I want to do here is get us to look at another set of strategies put together by the people listed here, Dr. Betty Smallwood, Linda Levine, and Laura Lukens. And these strategies are called Goto Strategies. Now, in the Goto Strategies, available on through the URL, we're not actually going to take time to go into them right now, but I really, really suggest you do when you have time yourself. So within the Goto Strategies, they are set up. I love the 5 principles that they base the whole strategies system on. So we're going to look at the 5 principles because I think they're really, really important for ELLs. And we're just going to look at each principle. I'm going to let you read this slide and the next slide on your own, and then I'm going to look at each principle separately and come up with an example of a strategy. In the Goto Strategies, it's organized, really well organized, so there are principles with Goto Strategies suggested for each, which would work for each principle. There's a glossary of the principles explaining them, and there's an inventory with principles with the strategies explained really, really well, including what teachers can do and what students can do with those strategies. So it's an excellent document. And available for free online. So hopefully you've had a chance to look at and read the little blurb about each one. Okay, so we'll start with Principle 1, which is focus on academic language literacy and vocabulary. And the example that I'm going to suggest to you is a math word wall. And suggest also that you remember that another principle that I've learned from another person, which is repetition and review. It's a principle of repetition and review. Frequently say, use, and play with those words. lots of things you can do with word walls, but what I'm really suggesting here is that those word walls, to be effective, have to be interactive. Best when they are student constructed with some teacher assistance, and best when they are changing constantly and when they are dynamic. So an example of what you might do with a word wall is do a walk the wall. Periodically have your students in pairs, and this is not just for your ELLs, this is good for all your students. Students in pairs walk the wall. They can do a lot of things. You can have different activities that they do when they walk the wall a couple of times a week. They might just be saying the words, using the words, playing a game with the words. So, and also continuously add examples to the word wall. Get the students to add examples that they're using from their math to their math word wall. Get the students to make up their own definitions, their own explanations of what the words mean. Get your students to connect with other words that are related, or family of words that are related to the words up there, and that helps them extend their vocabulary. And also get your students to put them into sentences or examples to show how they're used. So that's an example of. There are so many strategies that could be done under academic language literacy and vocabulary principle. Principle 2 is link to background knowledge and culture to the learning that you're doing. So the strategy I'm suggesting here is to encourage the strategic use of first language and to respect the knowledge that students bring with them, that your ELLs bring with them. Lots of things you can do in this way. One thing is to ask students who speak the same language, if you have that in the class. Not all the time do we, but if you do have, ask them to pair up. And in their own language, let them explore their understanding of the, let's say, the math word problem, or explore their understanding of a new vocabulary term. Very often one of the two will have a higher level, or maybe on a higher step level, and will be able to assist the other one with their understanding. Always they're coming back to you or back to the other students speaking in English, but it just helps them cognitively if they can speak in their own language, we are finding. Solving real problems with a connection to the ELL's culture is a really good idea, and let the ELLs extend the problem, use a different method perhaps that they might have used from their own schooling before they arrived in Canada, another way of solving something, and let them explain other ways to do that. Lots of different ways that we can respect their knowledge that they bring with them and their culture and their language. Principle 3, increase comprehensible input and language output. So we are always trying to make what we are presenting more understandable to the students as receptive language, and therefore their own expressive language or their language output hopefully will be better. So the strategy here is to contextualize the language to increase the level of comprehension. And there are lots of ways to do that. Obviously providing visuals helps put the words and the language into context. Gestures, facial expressions, body language, using real objects, using manipulatives, in math, using number lines, using timelines, diagrams, graphs, maps. All of these things will help the student understand the context without having to wade through a lot of language, a lot of words. And principle 4, promote classroom interaction. So many ways of doing this. The way that I'm suggesting is something called TPR, or Total Physical Response. I was at a conference last week, and I went to a session called Vertical Spaces, and basically it was the same sort of thing. So it's where you have students up and moving as they create, as they explore, and as they demonstrate using themselves as well as manipulative. Sorry, that should be or instead of. one example I saw of this was a long string, very, very, very long string that was joined, as in a circle, no ends to it. And they were exploring the use of, exploring geometry, shapes. So for each vertex, there had to be another person brought in, so they were making triangles and pentagons and so on and so on and so on. They were doing flips, they were doing rotations, just by manipulating the shapes. And I just want to suggest here that there's a little quote I want to give. Physical exercise is the single most important tool you have to optimize brain function. This is from John Ratty from the Harvard Medical School in a book called Spark, the Revolutionary New Science of Exercise in the Brain. And this idea, I think, is leading educators to understand that having students up and moving as they explore and as they develop and as they understand is a big part of keeping that brain function dynamic. So get kids up and moving and think of lots of ways that they can have total physical response. Principle 5, stimulate higher order thinking and the use of learning strategies. Again, many strategies that can be used here. The one I'm suggesting here is something called wait time. So we ask for ELLs who need extra time to translate in their head, to process what people are saying, to receive that language, and then to think of a response. Again, often in the early stages of language learning, they're still translating, so they need time. 5 seconds is suggested, or extended wait time, which is 10 seconds. Now, that doesn't sound like very much, but when you're waiting, it seems like quite a bit. I refer here also to Joe Bowler. And if we could put up the links that I put on that, Molly. I've got a couple of links there for Joe Bowler. One is a link to her UCubed. I'm not sure if Kathy's going to talk about that later, but she's a great mathematician, and the link is for Mathematical Mindsets, UCubed. Lots of great stuff. The other link for Joe Bowler is to a YouTube that she has where she's talking about at the very beginning, she talks about this strategy, this wait time strategy that she uses. And it's very simple. It's asking students, if you're asking students to think of something to solve a problem in their heads, to visualize something in their heads, you then ask them to, when they have found a solution or when they are ready, they use a thumb up, but instead of waving that thumb around, they hold it close to their chest, so that they're showing that they have their response ready. Now, and they just have to wait. And the teacher can see that the students have a response ready, but the students, while they're waiting, it also gives them time to rethink, to think through that response. Sometimes they change their mind and rethink it. It also gives kids time who are ELLs, or just kids who want more thinking time. It gives them time to do that without that waving of arms, I've got the answer, which often shuts down a lot of kids, shuts their thinking down if they see that. So wait time, good for lots and lots of kids in the classroom.
Excellent strategies. Now, Lisa had a question, and she might want to use the microphone. I can see that she asked that for the name of that book, The Spark. Can you repeat that name of the book? I'm sorry, my chat, I can't seem to write in it.
I can repeat it, and I didn't actually put it down. So it's
oh, there it goes. Look, Molly's got it. Spark, the revolutionary new science of exercise in the brain.
Well done.
Great book. Lisa, did you want to ask another question? I see some people have mentioned real interest in the physical component in the chat, and Mumtaz talks about using a learning carpet to teach rotations, flips and turns, that sort of thing. Lisa? If you do get a chance to turn your microphone on, that's great. We couldn't hear you. Do you want to try again? You have to push the talk button at the top. I think you maybe have. Yeah, we're getting some feedback there instead of your question. I'm sorry. Could you try typing it in the chat box? Yeah, not working. Sorry. So while she's doing that, Is there anything else you want to
say? Sue has said she likes the idea of physical graphing. Kathy and I just did a session in Toronto last week, and we did a physical graph with the adults who came to the session. And I guess we probably had almost 40 people in the session and made a live graph. And it's very visual, and I think it's very effective. And it gets kids up and moving, and they can see, you know, the lines, the bars. It's a very cool thing to do.
So hopefully, Lisa, you can add your question. There you go. Just wanted to comment, it's interesting that the physical component increases learning. Yes, it is almost the opposite of the traditional. And I remember reading an article that said you could replace up to a half of your school day with exercise and the kids would learn the same amount or more. So yes, we definitely want to get them up and learning. So we're going to get you doing some learning now, or doing some work for us. We're going to give you a fraction word problem.
Sorry, I had a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering, so I teach an intermediate, intermediate grades, and so I find that a lot of my students who are ELL learners, they kind of shy away from incorporating like their personal examples or experiences, as well as engaging. Like they're fairly shy because they are, I guess, scared to like kind of mess up or whatever. Is there any like strategies that I can use in my class to make those students feel a bit more comfortable?
So if I could just talk to that for a second. There's lots of things that you can do. I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Who are we speaking with?
Anyway, I think it's Lisa.
It's Sabrina, sorry.
Oh, Sabrina, sorry.
Sabrina? Okay, Sabrina. And this is where, again, these are strategies that can be used in a whole class situation, but they're really good for your ELLs. So the think, pair, share, or some version of that. Turn to your elbow partner, right? That's where your ELL will hopefully find confidence to speak with one other person. And that's also where you want to think about strategic grouping. So sometimes you want them to turn to somebody who speaks their own language, if there's somebody in the room, and they may need to do that. And then they may feel confident eventually to say something in English from that conversation that they had about the topic. Or you may want to group them so that they're turning to somebody who speaks English, but they're only having to speak to one person. So speaking in front of the whole group is a problem, is a challenge, but speaking to one person is not so much. And speaking in small groups. So presenting something, invite them to present just to a small group or to a group of 1 or 2 people they feel confident with. That's a start, right? So don't expect them to feel like they can expand and expound on their ideas in front of the whole class. That's pretty intimidating. So that's what I would suggest. Thanks for your question. It's great. Keep them coming, guys. And I see some more comments in the chat box, which is lovely. So I hope nobody's scared of fractions, but we're going to give you a word problem to try and solve yourself. If you have paper and pencil, great, or you just want to think about it in your head. We really want you to think about how students at different levels might go about solving this problem. And if you can come up with more than one way of solving it, that's fabulous. But as you're thinking of this problem, be thinking also of what strategies you might use to accommodate for English language learners, or perhaps what modifications could be made to the problem for students at different levels. Now, I'm going to ask Molly to put the link to this problem. It's from a resource by Kathy Fosno called Context in Learning Mathematics. And there are samples of her resources that are for sale on the website, and this is one of the samples. So it talks about a 5th grade class that goes on a field trip, but in 4 separate cars. And the school sent a lunch of submarine sandwiches for each group. When they stopped for lunch, the subs were cut and shared as follows. And sometimes it's important to put with this context that each person in each group got an equal sharing of the sub. So the one car, all the people in that car had equal amounts. In another car, everyone in that car got equal amounts. So the groups are here. So the first group had 4 people and shared 3 subs.
Second group had 5 people and shared 4 subs equally. Third group, 8 people with 7 subs shared equally. And the fourth group, 5 with 3. So then they get back and the kids start arguing that the different people in different cars got more or less sandwich than others. So they said it wasn't fair. And the kids need to figure out were they right, or did everybody get the same amount? Okay, so I'm going to come back to the slide in a second. And your assignment again is to solve the problem and see if you can solve it in multiple ways. And while you're doing that, think of, if you're giving this problem, what strategies would you use with your students to make sure that they could access the curriculum, or would you need to modify it for certain ELL students? And think again of your target students that you were identifying earlier in the session. So we're going to give you a couple of minutes just to think about this, just 2 minutes, and then we'll come back to, and it doesn't matter if you get the total answer because we're going to look at some sample solutions from kids, but just have a go.
How many minutes did you want, Kathy?
I'm timing it, but probably a minute now would be great. So I thank you, Alicia, for putting your answer in there. Alicia's got one of the logical sort of solutions that you can see there are 2 cars in which there are 3 subs. And so you can't have 4 people sharing 3 subs and then 5 people sharing 3 subs and it being equal, which is a great response. And I've done this with grade 4, with grade 5, grade 6, grade 7, and there's always somebody in the group that comes up with that very quick answer, showing with one example why it's not fair. You can also take a look at the second and the fourth group, and there's 5 people sharing different numbers of subs, so you can very logically eliminate it being fair. However, hopefully you're thinking of some ways as well as how the kids would be showing their work, how they would be modeling, and paying attention to some of the ways that they're thinking and modeling fractions. Certainly if you've got grade 4 students, they aren't yet drawing pictures, definitely, and they aren't necessarily, like they're coming in grade 4 is where the fraction part of the curriculum really develops. And they start talking about numerators and denominators and that sort of thing. I'm just going to, I know you didn't give you a whole lot of time to solve the problem, but you hopefully got your mind into the fraction mindset. And I'm going to show you some examples from Kathy Fosner's resource. And I put the link there, but it's the same link as above. And one way kids do get into this is by dividing the subs into halves at first until they run out of halves, and then they divide it into smaller groups. So here's a good answer. And Terry's very right that equal sharing is the same as division, and it's a very important point to bring up with kids. Here's another example where students take the subs and divide them all into the number of pieces that there are people in the car. So dividing it into 4 pieces or 5 pieces, and everybody gets one of those pieces. So you can see how kids start to think about it, this student has gone quarter plus a quarter plus a quarter equals 3/4. They've also got some multiplication in there. And it's interesting when you leave it open to kids, they often come up with math that is much farther above what you'd expect in giving them a close. We've got a couple more that I'm not going to talk about too much here. but you can dive into this resource to see some of the thinking behind. Here is, you come up with a common denominator example, and you sometimes get kids in grade 4 that are figuring out they're getting a ruler. I had kids that divided it into 12 because it was 12-inch sub, so they started dividing the 12 inches up. And Sabrina's Bright fraction strips are excellent for modeling this. So we're not going to go deep into the math behind it, but I want you to think about some of the strategies and put them up there in the chat box as we go along. What are some of the strategies you've either read about through Avis, we looked at earlier, that you read about in the resource, the STEP guide? What are some ways you might go about helping the kids access this curriculum? And Lisa's got a good point there in terms of modification. You'd reduce the number of buses for the students so they would have fewer fractions to compare. Now, I want to question you here, would that really be a modification? And that would be definitely dependent on how you're using the question. I think a student would still be accessing the curriculum if you gave them one example, well, even two examples to compare. Kids don't necessarily have to compare fractions until later on in the curriculum, so if they're at a grade 4 level, they could still access it without it being a modification, okay? So this slide that's up here now, you really have to know the curriculum, know what the expectations are at that grade level. So a student at grade 4 could still access that problem with one example, modeling it and talking about it, whereas maybe a grade 5 student would be expected to compare the fractions, okay? You have to know the continuum above and below your grade to figure out whether the student is actually able to access the curriculum without modification. I would suggest you also need to be open-minded because, as Ava said, some students may come with some different strategies from their own experience. You have to listen and ask questions and let them talk. So I'm seeing a lot of the things popping up that I'm going to talk about, and I'll come to your comments in a second. The strategies that we're going to use are going to be necessary for some but good for all. So some of you are mentioning multiple entry point problems, parallel problems. You might use smaller numbers, as Lisa said, simpler fractions, simpler numbers. And we want to wait and not introduce any sort of standard algorithm until we see it in the student's work. Okay, so some of you have mentioned key visuals. That's Mumtaz. Here's an example of how you might, something you might put up for the kids to see exactly what the background is. Alicia says the student might not know the term sub or submarine sandwich. So another thing is get real. Build up to the big problems, bring in the examples of what a sub-sandwich is. Provide opportunities for students to equally share before you give a big problem like that. Carrie says, ensure relevancy to the students. Do they know what a field trip was? Could you make this a connection to their experiences on field trips, okay? Someone else above mentioned the vocabulary. Link in the vocabulary. Keep talking about all sorts of words like even grouping or dividing. We've got vocabulary strategies that Avis talked about, student-generated vocab charts. I'm going to ask Molly to put a couple of links in to some more strategies like word quilts or sentence frames. Sentence frames are really important for getting students to use the academics vocabulary. So you've got some sentences where they just put in part of the sentence and they start practicing, but they're only responsible for putting in a number of words. Having the vocabulary handy, and as Mumtaz says, providing bilingual support in our school. We try and use the kids' vocabulary so that we've got the English and the Pennsylvania Deutsch, or at least with the younger kids getting an older child in to help explain in their language. As Ava said, allowing people to have that strategic use of their first language to discuss the problem in their own language and then come back to the English.
Kathy,
Carrie says,
could we ask Carrie to explain?
Yeah.
You just said we love sentence frames. Could you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Carrie, if you feel comfortable with talking to us, if your microphone works, if you wouldn't mind. You don't have to, but if you could talk to us about it, that would be great. Okay, you're talking a lot about them in your ESL class. No mic on this computer. Okay. Avis, did you want to say a little something more about the sentence frames? There's a link there to a document called Supporting ELLs in Mathematics that has a lot of, in your AQ course, sorry, gotcha. Link there. I am cognizant of the time here. Could we come back to that at the end if there's time?
Sure.
Avis turned her mic off. That's okay. Okay. So another strategy, and basically math talk, some people mentioned, is to support kids in their ability to describe what they're thinking. And, you know, teachers need to be using questions rather than saying something that a student could say. But when it comes to an ELL, an English language learner, you might need to provide those structures for helping them, like sentence frames, helping them fill in, providing the structure for the response where they can fill in some part of the sentence to give you an answer. Here's some examples of questions that we use when we're working with our students in math. I'm going to put a link to a document that I've made up based on an article, and hopefully Mally can put the link to both the frame that I made up as well as the document that it came from, which is a monograph. Basically provides some sentence starters for students to explain their thinking, to agree with someone else, disagree, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the sort of chart that I made up, but you know, you can make your own up with other sentence starters as well. And this is a way to help every student access the information and to have a good discussion with other people about their math.
Can I just add a little bit of information if you go back to that one for a second, Kathy? This is available. If you Google this, you will get a couple of sites which are really good. So one, in 2014, the OAME conference provided bookmarks with OAME on one side, and on the other side, this done very nicely in a bookmark form that you could use with your students. So that's one thing. You just Google it, you can print it off, it's all done, you can just print it off and use it. Laminate them, bookmark them, whatever you want to do with them for your students. And they're really good talking, good math talk, starters and things for kids to think about as they're developing their sense of math talk. And that's good for ELLs. Necessary for ELLs to give them the sentence structure that they need to be able to actually form a sentence or a question, but necessary for ELLs, but good for all the other students as well as they develop their math talk.
Yeah, and these same strategies, like you'll see that what's good in math is good for ELLs, and this document on spatial reasoning talks about the need for students to visualize, to verbalize, and to verify their thinking. And for us at our school, we're really looking into this visualize being not just in the head, but starting first with the acting out, with the doing, like Avis was talking about with the string, actually physically manipulating objects to get at how to do it even. And we found that some students who have learning disabilities in particular have difficulty visualizing it in their head without having a physical manipulative. So there's more information in this document. I see a lot of great comments coming here about math talk and scaffolding, which is excellent. Great comments. Christine's got the bookmark. Thank you for putting the link in and for finding that for us. I want to also reiterate that it's very important to listen to your students, and I'm going to get Mally to put a link to a YouTube video. It's just 3 minutes long. This is interviews with target students at my school. I do not have permission to put it in the body of this presentation, but I do have permission from the parents and the students themselves for you to access the link, to watch it on your own computer in a separate browser, and then come back. But the point of this interview was to find out from students what has helped them learn from older students, to find out what has helped them learn along their educational journey. What have been the barriers to their learning? And we played this video for our staff, and the effect on staff of not hearing somebody like myself or Avis talk about strategies that are good, but to actually hear it from the students themselves. And I think we defer to expert books and things for a lot of information at times, and they're great, but sometimes you know yourself as a teacher what is missing in your practice, and students know. So it's another great source of information for how to what strategies to use, how to accommodate for students. So if you wouldn't mind going to that link, Molly just put it in. It's a YouTube link. You need to copy it, open a separate page on your browser, and just put it in. And it's about 3 minutes long. So as soon as you've finished watching it, could you put a tick on your screen? And we'll leave you to watch that.
And you should be able to just click on it right from the chat box, so you can try that first, and if it doesn't work, then you can copy and paste it in.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks, Christine.
So Kathy and Avis, I just want to be cognizant of time, and it's just a couple minutes before the end. So if you can kind of wrap up, thanks.
Yeah. So I'm hoping people are coming back from the video. I see that there are some people that have finished, and your comments are very much on the mark that certainly when teachers come to our school and there's 40% of the population that are speaking another language, it can be very disconcerting not knowing what people are saying. We did use it, Carrie, as a professional development for a whole school. And their honesty was humbling to the staff, and the staff changed their practice on a whole, allowing the use of first language strategically to think through problems and talk through things. I think it's really important to engage your students as action researchers, and we've made them aware of the kind of things we're studying in our own practice, and they're helping us find some solutions, and they're very proud to see the effects of their voices on the staff, that they feel that their language is much more respected now, and they feel empowered. So it's important to use your own concerns and student concerns as a driver. It's a very, very motivational driver for change in practice. And when we share the findings with our students and with other staff, it improves practice overall. So we're going to leave you with two quotes. I'm going to give you a moment to read this one and then the next one, and leave that as a reflection piece. And the second quote. And I think in those two quotes, there's a balance, there's a tension between, wanting students to lead us where we're going, but again, respecting the struggle to speak in the other language. And as Lisa says, it can be very frustrating learning in another language. It takes a lot of energy. We want to encourage you to contact us if you have any questions. I know we haven't left a lot of time for discussion at the end, so please, Mally's put our emails in there. If you have any more questions, feedback, want a resource that you don't find in the resources that Mally's going to post on the OTS site at the end, do let us know. You're very welcome.
So thanks, Kathy and Avis. That was an excellent session, really thorough understanding of the process and of working with these students, and I think they all summed it up really well in that video. That's a very powerful video for anyone that's working with ELLs and in classrooms. So thank you so much for your time and your passion. It's really clear that this is what you love, and you do it so well. So thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight and spending a busy May evening. I know that we all know that it's a really busy time of year, and we really appreciate you being here. So if just a couple of housekeeping things at the end. First of all, there's when you exit out of the program, there'll be a feedback survey that will pop up, or you can access it by clicking on the link that's on the whiteboard, or also by clicking on the link that's in the chat box. And if you could fill that out, that would be great. For a couple of reasons, it provides Kathy and Avis with some feedback, and also OTF Connects and the Ministry of Education, who funds these programs. And also, when you complete it, you will be sent an email that will have a certificate of participation that will be great for your personal or your professional portfolio. So we'd really appreciate that you completing that. There are some more. OTF Connects goes right till the end of May. There are some more sessions coming up. If you would like to participate, you can go to the OTF Connects website to to register for those. There's some great ones coming up. And also, if you're looking forward to the summer and thinking about some summer professional development, give yourself a little bit of a rest and then join OTF for some really great sessions. At the Summer Institute, the registration opens May 16th, and the link is on the page and will also be sent in the resource, with the resource page. So once again, thank you for coming, and we will hopefully see you again soon. And we really thank Avis and Kathy for a fantastic session. So if you, once you log out, you'll be sent right to the feedback link, and thank you very much for filling that out.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you, everybody, for participating.